Well, future nephews and nieces, I thought I'd switch it up today and do a video outdoors. The sun is shining, the skies are clear, and the winds are relatively calm. I thought this would be a perfect setting to talk about the things I'm about to discuss with you. Today I want to tell you about the dot-com bubble because I lived through it and I was here in the heart of Silicon Valley when it happened. Now, when I was a kid, most people didn't want to be computer programmers or software engineers. It was kind of seen as a position for nerds. I mean, if you said you wanted to be a computer programmer, it was like telling somebody you wanted to be an accountant or something. Then everything changed with the internet boom. All of a sudden, all these companies came out, and as long as it had a .com behind their name, it seemed like their company valuations would soar. These computer programmers would become overnight millionaires. I mean, their company stock would IPO, and the stock would just surge. We actually had this joke about the Acura NSX. We called it the IPO car, because every time a company IPO'd, it seemed like there was more Acura NSXs on the road. So then everybody wanted to become a computer programmer, and I could understand why. They wanted to go to college, graduate, join a company, have it IPO, and then retire a multimillionaire. So I still remember in the summer of 1999, I was having this discussion with one of my coworkers. I was telling him how the valuations were just insane. I mean, a lot of these companies were being valued at billions of dollars, yet they weren't making any money. They had revenue, but they weren't actually earning anything. And I still remember what he told me. He said, yeah, but the stocks just keep going up. As if that was a proper justification. Of course, things like this never last forever. They never do. And on March 10th, 2000, the stock market peaked and the dot-com bubble burst. The NASDAQ fell almost 80% from its height. So a lot of money was just wiped out. My mom still remembers that time where engineers had to take time off of work and rush to their brokers to meet their margin calls. And if you don't know what a margin call is, look it up. I won't explain it to you right now. And don't watch that movie Margin Call if you want an explanation, because that movie has nothing to do with a margin call. Although it's not a bad movie. I also remember grandmas being interviewed talking about how they lost all their retirement savings gambling on tech stocks. I mean, this bubble just sucked a whole bunch of people in. And they just kept believing that it would keep going, that it would never stop. And that was the insanity. Of course, things ended. Things like this always do. And suddenly, being a computer programmer wasn't such a desirable job anymore. In fact, it was pretty hard for computer programmers to find work after the market crash because so many businesses went belly up. And that was the dot-com bubble. Well, I had to move location because the other place was getting a little too loud. So let's talk about the great financial crisis. So this huge housing bubble formed. And I remember it seemed like housing was going up by 20% a year, which is insane because people's incomes weren't going up by 20% a year, not even close. From what I understand, between 1998 and 2006, the typical American house went up by 124%. So how did housing valuations get so high? Well, there were a number of things in play. First, banks were giving loans to almost anybody. They wrote a whole bunch of subprime loans to people who had bad credit scores. There were also this thing called ninja loans they were writing, where they had no income, job, or asset verification. And a lot of these people, they're perfectly fine lying on their mortgage applications, saying that, oh yeah, I made this much money and I have this many assets. And that way, A bunch of people who shouldn't have been buying houses, who couldn't afford houses, were suddenly getting houses. So you may be wondering, weren't the banks afraid these borrowers couldn't pay back the loans? And the answer was no. Because what they would do is they would take these loans and they would sell it to an investment bank or investment firm right away. And these investment banks would package these loans into these things called mortgage-backed securities. And they would sell them to things like pension funds who were looking for fixed income. So why weren't the pension funds worried about these mortgage-backed securities? Well, as it turns out, the credit rating agencies gave them AAA or AA ratings, which is one of the highest you can get. And they did this because they wanted to get the business from these investment banks. And they knew that if they gave these mortgage-backed securities bad ratings, these investment banks would just go to a different rating agency. Now you might be wondering, well, where was the government during all this? Where was the oversight? And the answer is there wasn't really that much oversight. The SEC was asleep at the switch. That's the Security Exchange Commission. And there is also this thing called credit default swaps, where you could buy insurance on these mortgage-backed securities. So if the mortgage-backed security went bust, the insurance policy would pay off. But I'm not going to get into that because that's just way too complicated. So then when you think about it, in order for the great financial crisis to happen, you had to have irresponsibility at every single level. The people taking out the loans were being irresponsible. The people giving the loans were being irresponsible. The people packaging these loans into mortgage-backed securities and selling them to pension funds were being irresponsible. The credit rating agencies were being irresponsible. And the government was asleep at the switch. So this housing bubble just kept building and building and building, and nobody thought it would end. They even asked Ben Bernanke, who would eventually become the Federal Reserve chairman, if he thought that the housing market was in a bubble, and he said no. And I remember I was in a bar once talking with a guy, telling him how these valuations for housing didn't make any sense, that they were insane. And he said, yeah, but the housing prices keep going up, as if that was a proper justification. Does this sound familiar? Of course, everything did end. And if you want to point to a pivotal moment that caused the markets to collapse, it's when Lehman Brothers folded on September 15th, 2008. So why am I telling you this right now? Well, as of recording this, America's been in a prolonged bull market. Stock valuations are ridiculous again. Housing valuations are ridiculous again. We even had this thing called cryptocurrencies, which I still don't see the value in, yet they trade for thousands and thousands of dollars. And when I tell people all this stuff is just overvalued, the response I get is, yeah, but the prices keep going up, as if that was a proper justification. The Dow Jones Industrial Average just dropped by almost 4,000 points in the last 2 days. Will it come back again? Yeah, probably. And then it'll go down, then it'll come back. That's just how it goes. Predicting the stock market on a day-to-day basis is just too difficult. But what I will say is that America has been in a prolonged period of prosperity. I mean, unemployment has been pretty low and GDP has been pretty high for a while now. And it's made everybody complacent. I mean, people talk about it as if it'll never end. And it's amazing how these manias always happen, and they happen over and over again, and we just don't seem to learn. We don't learn that good times don't last forever. So I'd like to end the video today telling you a story you may have heard before about the grasshopper and the ant. In the story, the grasshopper was jumping around, having fun, because it was summertime. The sun was out, the skies were clear, and the winds were calm. But then the grasshopper came across an ant who was hard at work storing food away. And the grasshopper asked the ant, "What are you doing?" And the ant told the grasshopper, "We're preparing for the winter." The grasshopper laughed at this because he told the ant, "Winter's not coming. Look at the sun, look at the sky. It's going to be like this forever." And the grasshopper hopped away. He thought the ant was wasting his time. Of course, a few months later, winter did come. And while the ant was safe in the anthill, feeding off the stores they had collected during the summer, the grasshopper was left out in the cold, and it starved to death. So I guess what I'm trying to tell you, future nephews and nieces, if you are experiencing a current period of mania, and people will tell you that the good times will never end, don't believe it, because winter is coming.